Every cast that gets ignored provides a specific piece of data, but most beginners misread that rejection as a simple problem with lure color or bad luck. The reality is that a base actively decides to ignore a presentation based on a strict hierarchy of physical and biological signals, and visual color is often at the very bottom of that list. When a bass tracks your bait and turns away at the last second, it is not acting randomly, but rather responding to a specific sensory mismatch that you accidentally created. Research into bass sensory physiology shows that their lateral line and inner ear can process environmental anomalies long before their eyes ever lock onto a target. By the end of this video, you will have a concrete framework to diagnose exactly why a fish turned away, taking the guesswork out of the rejection. You will stop wondering if you chose the wrong plastic worm, and instead understand exactly how your positioning, your retrieve angle, and your water disturbance gave you away. There are three main things this video covers: how water pressure and ground vibration broadcast your presence, why the angle of the sun renders your lure choice entirely useless in certain positions, and what a following fish is actually testing before it abruptly aborts the strike. None of this requires a boat or an expensive depth finder, because all of these variables can be read directly from the bank. Most anglers believe that if they can cast near a piece of structure without snagging, they have done their job, and the rest is up to the fish. That logic fails because a bass does not evaluate a meal based simply on proximity. A base evaluates a target based on how it interacts with the water column, the current, and the structure itself. To understand the 10 specific reasons a fish ignores your lure, we have to look at how these errors compound around a single, common piece of structure. Imagine a large, fallen hardwood tree extending from the bank into a slow-moving section of water. This is a textbook holding area, but it is also the perfect laboratory to see exactly where the beginner goes wrong. The first reason your lure is ignored happens before you even unhook your bait from the rod guide. It is the mechanical vibration of your approach. Sound travels roughly 4.8 times faster in water than it does in the air. When you walk heavily on a hard bank, those low-frequency seismic waves transfer directly into the water column. Bass do not have external ears, but they possess calcium carbonate structures called otoliths in their inner ear that are highly sensitive to low-frequency vibrations and particle motion. If you step heavily within 30 feet of that fallen tree, the otoliths have already registered your approach as a terrestrial anomaly, putting the fish on high alert before the first cast. But even if you manage to approach the bank with absolute silence, the second reason your lure gets rejected is dictated by the geometry of light. Beginners often ignore Snell's window, which is the optical phenomenon that compresses a fish's view of the world above the surface into a 97-degree cone. If the sun is behind your back, your silhouette and the movement of your casting arm are projected directly into that window and onto the surface of the water over the tree. Bass use overhead shadows to detect avian predators, and a sudden, unnatural shadow sweeping across their holding position triggers an immediate suppression of their feeding instinct. You might have approached quietly, but if you cast your shadow over the primary branches of that tree, the spot is effectively dead for the next 20 minutes. Yet, assuming you crept up quietly and kept your profile low to avoid casting a shadow, the third reason a fish ignores the bait comes down to hydrodynamic alignment. Water is almost never perfectly still. There is always a microcurrent driven by wind or main lake flow pushing through the branches of that fallen tree. Bass invariably position themselves facing into this current because it delivers food directly to them and requires less caloric energy to maintain their position. If you cast upstream and drag your lure down with the flow, you are doing it right. But the beginner often casts downstream and retrieves against the current, dragging the lure up behind the fish. Because a bass has a blind spot directly behind its tail, a lure approaching from the rear forces the fish to turn around in a defensive posture rather than an offensive feeding posture. They ignore the bait because prey does not naturally swim hard upstream against the flow to attack a predator from behind. Even if you get the current angle right, the fourth reason your presentation is rejected happens at the exact moment of touchdown. The acoustic signature of the landing dictates the initial reaction of the fish. A heavy tungsten weight crashing directly into the center of the tree sends a high-amplitude shockwave through the water. Natural prey, like a frog slipping off a branch or a dying shad fluttering to the surface, enters the water with a muted, specific displacement. When your lure crashes with the acoustic signature of a thrown rock, the fish's lateral line registers a threat rather than a meal, and they will sink deeper into the cover and ignore the subsequent movement. However, let us say you pitch the bait silently into the current, perfectly aligned with the tree. The fifth reason the fish ignores it is a disconnect in the depth plane. Bass have their eyes positioned toward the top of their skull, granting them excellent upward and forward binocular vision to spot silhouettes against the surface light. They are biologically engineered to strike upward. If you let your lure fall entirely to the bottom and drag it through the mud beneath the main trunk of the tree, you're forcing the bass to feed downward, which is highly inefficient for their anatomy. A fish suspended just under the main trunk will simply watch a bait crawl in the mud below it and refuse to expend the energy to nose down into the silt. If you correct the depth, the sixth error revolves around a complete misunderstanding of the shade line. The branches of that fallen tree cast a distinct shadow on the water. Beginners tend to drag their lure right through the middle of the brightest sunlit water near the tree, hoping the flash will attract the fish. But bass lack eyelids, and their retinas take significant time to adjust to bright light. They hold inside the dark water of the shadow, using the boundary line as an ambush point to watch the brightly lit water. If your lure does not cross that specific transition zone from light to dark, the bass will ignore it because it never entered their primary feeding window. But what if you run the bait perfectly across the shade line at the right depth, and they still do not bite? The seventh reason comes down to metabolic speed, especially in transitional water temperatures. As water cools, a bass's metabolism slows down, and so does the movement of the natural forage base in that environment. If you are burning a crankbait or aggressively hopping a jig past that tree when the water is 50 degrees, the visual speed of the lure contradicts the thermal reality of the environment. The fish ignores the bait because nothing natural moves that fast when the water is that cold. The speed itself screams that the object is artificial. Even if you slow down and match the metabolic pace, the eighth mistake is purely behavioral. Beginners tend to retrieve their lures in a perfectly straight, linear line all the way back to the bank. When real prey, a bluegill or a crawfish, approaches a solid piece of structure like the trunk of that fallen tree, it reacts to it. A crawfish scurries away from the wood. A bluegill darts erratically as it realizes it is exposed. If your lure swims in a mechanical, perfectly straight line right past the heaviest part of the cover without deflecting, changing speed, or altering its trajectory, it lacks the erratic panic of real prey. The bass ignores it because the mechanical perfection of the retrieve proves it is not a living creature. This leads us to the ninth reason, which is the most frustrating for a bank angler to witness, the follow. You cast perfectly. The lure deflects off a branch. A bass tracks it out of the tree, follows it for 10 feet, and then turns away. Beginners think the fish saw the hooks or didn't like the color. In reality, a following bass is using the neuromasts in its lateral line to feel the hydrodynamic wake of the lure. The lateral line detects the minute water displacement pushed by the object. If the visual size of your lure does not match the water displacement it is creating, for example, a massive swim bait that barely moves any water, or a tiny finesse worm displacing too much water due to a heavy unnatural weight, the sensory mismatch causes the fish to abort. The eyes say food, but the lateral line says fraud. Finally, the 10th reason a fish ignores your lure happens at the very end of the cast. The beginner sees the bank approaching and simply lifts the lure out of the water to make another cast. In nature, the bank or the water's surface acts as a biological wall, an edge where prey is trapped and predators strike. When you pull the lure out of the water at a constant speed just as it nears the bank, you remove the psychological trigger of the trap. A following bass is waiting for the prey to panic as it runs out of water. By lifting it out casually, you kill the illusion. Everything covered so far: the approach vibration, the shadow, the current angle, the acoustic landing, the depth plane, the shade line, the metabolic speed, the lack of deflection, the sensory mismatch, and the premature exit, assumes the fish is just making isolated decisions. But bass do not evaluate these variables one by one. What the fish is actually doing is reading the entire environmental signature at once. The same lateral line that feels your heavy footsteps is also feeling the current pushing against the tree, and the same eyes that hate the bright sun are tracking the exact speed of your lure. A rejection is rarely about the fish being too smart. It is about you failing to make all the sensory inputs tell the exact same story at the exact same time. When the vibration, the depth, and the speed all align with what the fish expects to feel and see, the strike is involuntary. If this changed how you read the water, there are more videos here that work the same way. No magic lures, no expensive gear, just practical ways to find and catch more fish. Subscribing makes sure you don't miss the next one. Before your next cast, ask yourself what the water is doing around the structure and align your presentation with the current, the shade, and the natural depth. Identify the edge, predict the lateral line signature, and force the bait to act like it is trapped.